Hello, this is your mini lecture for Chapter 12. These are neurological conduct disorders. There's actually lots of different disorders that are in this chapter. However, I really want to focus on predominantly 4 different disorders that we're going to talk about today. The first one is intellectual developmental disorder, intellectual developmental disorder, IDD. And I'm going to talk about how that's different from autism spectrum disorder, because sometimes people get those two confused. So we're going to talk about those two. We're also going to talk about ADHD, and we're also going to talk about conduct disorder, and a little bit about ODD, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, which is like a lighter form of conduct disorder. So these are really the disorders that I want you to focus on as you're studying for this chapter. The exam will weigh these disorders heavily in the etiology and treatments for these disorders. However, if you do take the chapter quiz, it will have the entire chapter on it. So you may be responsible for some of the other disorders within this chapter. All right, let's start with IDD, intellectual developmental disorder. We used to call it mental retardation. We do not use that term anymore. That is now an outdated term, and for good reason. There's a lot of stigma that comes with the idea of mental retardation, and society kind of took it and turned it into a bad word, and so we actually no longer use that. So for some of you, you might read articles that are old enough that they're still using mental retardation, because that was the clinical term up until last year. And I might have mentioned we don't use that term anymore, now it's IDD. Here's the thing about IDD that is important. Number one, we're going to see the onset of IDD very early on. Most people do not get IDD later on in life. If they do, it's usually because it's of some sort of traumatic brain injury or something that has occurred in the environment. But for most IDD individuals, we're going to have an onset during childhood. It's going to be during a specific developmental period. We're going to see deficits in their intelligence, in their IQ. And we measure this a lot of different ways. One is with an IQ test. So we're going to be looking for some deficits on that IQ testing. But that alone does not mean that you have IDD. We're going to do a clinical interview, and we're going to be sort of really looking to see, is this an intellectual thing, or is there something else going on? So you must have some deficits in your intellectual ability, and you have to have deficits in what we call adaptive functioning. That's about functioning within the world. And so those deficits could be academic, not just a learning disorder, but you just really, really struggle on specific academic-related things. It could be things involving hygiene. That's one of the biggest issues we see with people with IDD. They don't know that they need to shower on a regular basis, or brush their teeth, or brush their hair, and it's really, really hard for them to learn those kinds of routines. So the book will talk a little bit about the different kinds of deficits we see in adaptive functioning, but you really have to have that plus the deficit in the intelligence in order to have IDD. Now, we divide IDD into 4 different categories: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. And the vast majority of individuals with IDD are in that mild category. So they just have some mild deficits that they need help with, and if they get an intervention early enough, and if those interventions continue and they get case management through their life, a lot of them can actually live fairly independently. They can live either within their own apartment with a little bit of help, or in a group home, or something along those lines. And so that's the vast majority of people with IDD. It's very rare that you'll see somebody that's down here on that profound range, and a lot of that has to do with the etiology. For those people that would be that low functioning, likely something went wrong inner utero, or something went wrong genetically, and so sometimes those children don't actually even survive because of how badly things went wrong genetically. So that's why the vast majority are mild, and the book will talk a lot about some of the different ways, some of the different interventions that can be done with those individuals. I do want to point out that about 1/3 of the etiology for IDD is a known genetic cause. So when we're talking about something like Down syndrome, or I just had a brain issue. Down syndrome, or X-linked diseases, or things along those lines, which the book does talk about some of the genetic ones, PKU, things along those lines. Those are known genetic deficits, and so oftentimes there's something genetically that just went wrong during conception or in utero. And I've got a nice little visual here in utero, and so the child is born with it, and so there's really not a lot we can do if it's a genetic one. If it's something like PKU, which is a genetic deficit where you can't metabolize a certain type of chemical that's in food, then we can actually control it through diet, and we can stop that individual if we know right away, which they now do testing immediately for PKU. If we know right away, we can stop it through diet, and then you don't actually end up with IDD. But those that we don't know, and they end up getting that chemical not metabolizing, the result is often IDD that's irreversible. So the book will talk a lot about the etiology, but a lot of the etiology that we're going to look at really is biological and genetic. So let's separate IDD from autism spectrum disorder. And there's a lot of information out there for autism spectrum disorder. Those of you that have that are in education, you might have already had a class on that focuses a lot on autism spectrum disorder. We're just going to touch a little bit on it. Here's the criteria for that. You have to have, again, the onset in childhood. Usually we're looking before the age of 3. Before the age of 3, we're going to see signs and symptoms, if we're paying attention, that autism is being developed. So we don't know right away when the child is born, but we're going to know within those first 3 years of life that something's wrong. The major deficit here is not intellectual like it is in IDD, it's actually social communication. And that's going to range the gamut as well. So oftentimes when I talk about sort of identifying autism, one of the first things I'm going to look for is eye contact. A lot of people with autism don't know that they should maintain eye contact, or they don't know how to maintain eye contact. It's a lot of stuff in terms of understanding nuances of social interaction, social conversations, understanding sarcasm, things along those lines. And it can go all the way to not speaking. And a lot of times that's how we might identify a child, is that they're really, really slow in terms of their language development, and some children with autism never ever learn how to speak. They just never get there. And so we see a really wide gamut in terms of social communication deficits, but they must have some deficits. They also must have some sort of repetitive or restrictive behaviors, and they must have a couple of those. And again, this ranges. So it could be that they are just really, really focused on a particular topic. I worked with a young man with autism spectrum disorder who just loved NASCAR, and he knew everything there was about NASCAR, and he just sort of permeated about NASCAR. And he became fixated on it. That's a repetitive sort of thing. A lot of autism children or children with autism, will take a ball and they'll bounce it against the wall, and they'll do that for hours and hours, very repetitive, but that will be comforting to them. Sometimes you see them very restricted in terms of their schedules. They can't adapt to changing schedules. At 5 o'clock I do this, at 5:30 I do this, and there's no adaptation there. I need the green plate, and I don't want the yellow plate, and if I get the yellow plate, then I don't know how to handle it. So some sort of restrictive behaviors. So you'll notice it's very different than IDD. IDD is about intellect and adaptive functioning, whereas here we have social communication, and we have these sort of restrictive, repetitive behaviors. Now, you can have autism and also have IDD. So there could also be some intellectual issues there, but not necessarily. So the majority of people with autism, just barely, I think some statistics say around 60–70% of children with autism are likely to have IDD as well and are diagnosed with it. But that still leaves a good portion of children that do not have any intellectual deficits, but they have deficits in other areas, so we have to figure out how to reach them. The TED Talk that I'm asking you to watch for Temple Grandin really speaks to this really, really well, that the way that we look at intellect really needs to change as we're talking about somebody with autism spectrum disorder. The very last thing is we do divide autism spectrum disorder up a little bit now, because the new DSM has combined Asperger's, pervasive developmental disorder, into autism spectrum disorder. We now divide it up into somebody who requires support, which would be like a mild version of autism, might be what we used to call Asperger's. Somebody who requires substantial support, and somebody who requires very substantial support. Nobody said psychologists were creative. So those are the 3 different levels that we use now when we're diagnosing somebody with autism spectrum disorder, and that kind of tells us sort of where their functioning is at. All right, those are those 2. Now let's move on to sort of some of the conduct or impulsive sort of disorders. We'll start with ADHD. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I always point out in every single class that I ever teach, there is no such thing as ADD. General practitioner doctors will even sometimes diagnose people with ADD, attention deficit disorder, and it drives me bonkers because it doesn't exist. You will never find it in the DSM. There are different types of ADHD, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but there is no such thing right now as ADD. Maybe in the future, but not now. So here are our criteria for ADHD. Again, we need an early onset, so we have to see symptoms of ADHD before the age of 12. So it can't be that you are totally fine and then at the age of 24, all of a sudden you have ADHD. You have to at least have had some symptoms before the age of 12 that we can identify in order to diagnose you that way. The second one, multiple settings. You can't have these behaviors and these symptoms only in one setting. So it can't just be in school, it can't just be with the parents, it has to be in multiple settings that this is occurring. The third one, there has to be some sort of deficit that's going on, either socially, academically, or occupationally. And so academically you're struggling in school, or socially you're having a hard time making friends, because some of the behaviors of ADHD are really hard to make friends. So think about a child who can't stop talking, a child who's really hyperactive, really impulsive, just running around crazy. It's hard to be friends with that person when you're young, because you want them to follow the rules, you want them to listen to you, you want to be able to talk as a child. And so they oftentimes have a lot of social impairment as well. So you have to have some sort of deficit there. And then finally, we have this list of symptoms. So you have to have at least 6 symptoms that are what we call inattentive. Those are the symptoms that are having, you're struggling to focus, you're distracted easily, things like that. Or hyperactive and impulsive. So those are the talking a lot, the running around, things like that. Or you can have both. And this is what leads us to the 3 different types of ADHD. So there's ADHD inattentive type, ADHD hyperactive type, or ADHD combined type. If you have the combined type, you have at least 6 symptoms that are inattentive, and you have 6 symptoms that are hyperactive, so you have both of them. Most children are diagnosed with the combined type. They actually have all of those symptoms. But those children who get that ADD diagnosis is actually ADHD inattentive type. That's what their code is, if you will. So make sure you don't confuse that. And that's sort of ADHD in a nutshell. A lot of us are pretty familiar with that. It's becoming a fairly common diagnosis. Conduct disorder. So conduct disorder is our big disruptive one. And oftentimes we see conduct disorder diagnosed before we see antisocial personality disorder diagnosed later in adulthood. And so if you haven't looked at the mini lecture on personality disorders, make sure you do that because those two are linked. So again, we're looking at a childhood illness here, so it has to be diagnosed before the age of 18. And there's 2 different pathways. There's a childhood onset, where it gets diagnosed before the age of 10 years old, and an adolescent onset, so after the age of 10 it gets diagnosed. And these 2 pathways do actually have different prognosis. The childhood one means that you have sort of some substantial problems, and what we're likely to see in those adults are continued substantial problems. Those are the adults that are likely to go to prison for a substantial amount of time, a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years. Those are the adults that are likely to have substance abuse issues. Those are the adults that may become violent, may become domestic, have some domestic violence issues that crop up later in life. And so they really have a big struggle through adulthood. But if the diagnosis is after the age of 10, then we usually see a slightly better prognosis. So those adults oftentimes, by the time they've reached adulthood, have kind of cleaned up their act. They might always sort of be a little rough around the edges, but they're not likely to have substantial problems. They're able to hold a job and have a family and sort of have some pretty adaptive functioning. The big thing with conduct disorder is a violation of others' rights. The big thing is that these children with conduct disorder have a hard time with empathy. They don't mind hurting somebody else or manipulating somebody else or stealing from somebody else because they don't really think about how their behaviors impact other people. They're very callous. Callous is a really good way of sort of describing conduct disorder. And so there's different ways that we would define this. So within a year's time, you have to have at least 3 acts, and those are defined really well in the book, but basically we're talking about aggression, not just a fight, but major aggression, bullying, a fight with a weapon, things like that. Destruction of property, fire setting, things like that. Theft, heavy-duty theft, breaking into a home, stealing, taking lots of money from their parents, not just a 5 or a 10 here and there, but stealing massive amounts of money and things like that. And a serious rule violation, so not coming home late, like 10 minutes late from curfew, but staying out all night. That's a serious rule violation. So they have to have at least 3 acts within a year, and then that's going to classify a conduct disorder. Now, a smaller version of this is what we call ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. And that's really, and again, there's the criteria listed in your book, but those are the teenagers that are like, they've got the teenager attitude, but it's a little bit more ramped up. It's extreme irritability, it's extreme defiance, they're maybe yelling more, I mean, it's not just the typical, I'm raging with my parents, but it's really battling with your parents. It's really being vindictive with your siblings. It's really an extreme version of sort of this idea of a teenager attitude, if you will. And so ODD, again, you can look at the criteria there. I think it's 5. You have to have 5 criteria out of the 7. And you can be diagnosed with that and then sort of work through it through therapy and then not have it anymore. Conduct disorder is much more serious. There's something more ingrained in the person that's going on. So that is essentially the 4 major different types of, and they're really childhood illnesses that I want you guys to sort of get a handle on and understand. Make sure you're looking at some of the etiology, make sure you're looking at some of the treatment, some of the research that's going on, especially with ADHD and the medication. It's a hot topic right now. As always, if you have questions, make sure you post them right below on this link, and I'll be sure to get to your questions. Thank you.